This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 5 to 7 of Seminar 5. Back in high school, I had a friend whose mom was very anxious and concerned about eating food that was too hot. From what I recall, her worry was that burning your mouth would increase the chance of developing cancer. I didn't know whether there was any truth to that claim, but her insistence had a way of ingraining the concern in your mind. When in college, I met up with this friend at a restaurant several years after not seeing him, and introduced him to my girlfriend at the time. Upon taking the first bite of my meal, I slightly burned my mouth on the hot food, and it was at that point I suddenly blurted out in a serious tone, "You know, every time I eat hot food, I always think of your mom." My friend and girlfriend, understandably, gave a look of surprise, followed by some nervous laughter. And it was at that moment I suddenly realized the implication of what I said and quickly tried to fix things by explaining the context behind my statement, all of which led to a good laugh, mostly at my expense for the naivete of my statement. Notably, following that exchange, I stopped thinking of my friend's mom every time I ate hot food. We can make a few relevant observations here in light of Lacan's theorizing on jokes and witticisms. The humor of my declaration was not established until the other confirmed it. It was not my intention to make a joke, and in fact, a major component in it being funny was the naivete of the speaker. Also notable is that the statement surprised the other. And what surprised the other was a statement that carries with it an implied transgression of a social norm, desiring another's mother. Finally, the meaning of my own statement was given to me from the other, who retroactively conferred upon it this sense. Despite not intending it, the added meaning to my statement now forever changed my relationship with the thought of hot food and its associations with my friend's mother, to the point that I stopped making that connection between them. We're going to see how these observations tie into the themes of Lacan's lectures being covered in this video today. Lecture 5 begins with discussing the formulation of demand through its transformation of need and its remainder of desire. This is a theme I spent a good deal of time on in the first 3 videos of this seminar. But what is important here is how the formulation of demand and the remainder of desire converges with the formulation of jokes and witticisms. Briefly, Lacan defines demand as what in need gets conveyed by means of signifiers addressed to the other. It is the way a need gets recognized, but in recognizing a need through the articulation of signifiers, need is transformed, acquiring something inherently excessive about it. The point is that the formulation of need as demand is not a pure translation of need, nor is the acceding to a demand the same as the satisfaction of this transformed need. There is always a remainder left unsatisfied in meeting a demand, a deeper no delivered in every yes. This is what Lacan calls desire. Further influencing the formulation of demand, the subject must consider the coordinates of the other. How I formulate a demand requires that I borrow signifiers from the other, whose situatedness within a symbolic order contains its own parameters and rules. In this manner, I learn to request things indirectly by asking for an object that is admissible to the other, the object the other is willing to desire, and perhaps we might add willing to desire on my behalf. Consequently, the message communicated in demand is fundamentally ambiguous, making a meeting point between the subject's alienated desire and the other's desire. Witticisms exploit the inherent ambiguities of language, wherein we find these meeting points of alienated desire and desire of the other. If we recall from the previous video the example I provided of my daughter suggesting I put ice in my mouth upon my asking her if she had some advice for how to cool down my anger. We can see how the ambiguity of language allows for the humorous effect in this situation. The message is reduced in such a way as to place the demand upon the other, for whom I was positioned in relation to my daughter. The demand here is for the other to authenticate the message. It's important to keep in mind that for Lacan, speech is inherently demanding. It demands the other to listen, to recognize, to validate, to respond. And yet, what my demand intended to do and what the other affirms of this demand are not tied to the same significations. In his discussion of sense and nonsense in this lecture, Lacan emphasizes that what produces the humorous effect is not principally a play on nonsense, but more precisely entails how bad words are at maintaining their full sense. This is what he means by the term a bit of sense, le peu de sens. The exchange with my daughter begins with a metaphor that I have provided, cooling down for calming anger, and seemingly ends with a metonymic displacement, the reduction of cooling down to its literal relation to ice. Rather than taking up the full meaning of the signifiers I employed, my daughter takes up only a bit of it, leading to a degradation of meaning, or what Lacan calls here, descents, descent. The subject, my daughter, addresses the other, traveling along the metonymic dimension, communicating something unexpected. The pleasure of a joke comes partly in surprising the other. Earlier in this lecture, Lacan states that surprise is consubstantial with what desire is once it passes to the level of the unconscious. And this is because a desire that is not unconscious, by definition, does not surprise because we are already aware of what we desire and what the other desires of us. But if it's unconscious, then if it hits us, it's going to hit us out of the blue. And as such, what surprises the other here is the return of repressed desire, something that the code did not permit getting expressed but finds its way into language nonetheless. This is most evident in the exchange with my friend. In the example with my daughter, what surprises her might be her desire to tell me to shut up by suggesting that I put ice in my mouth, thereby allowing for the indirect expression of inhibited, aggressive tendencies. She has, after all, been known to reproach me explicitly at times for some choice words I've spoken in front of her in the past. We can see here perhaps an example of something not allowed to be expressed being covertly smuggled into language through the appropriation of the signifiers I gave her, which allows her message to be communicated through this degradation of sense. Yet for these humorous effects to be fully accomplished, it's not enough to say that the other is surprised, but also that the other takes up this bit of sense and confers upon it a signification. This is what Lacan calls here a step of sense, pas de sens. What traveled along the metonymic line as a bit of sense now comes to travel down the metaphorical line as a step of sense. In the story with my friend, whereas I was talking about literal hotness as it pertained to my food and past concrete interactions with my friend's mom, the reaction of the other delivered to the signifier hot, its metaphorical sense referring to sexual attraction. All this highlights at least two things. First, there is an interdependence of metonymy and metaphor, or the bit of sense and the step of sense. Even if the content seems to imply merely a metonymical act, the form of the situation reveals the metaphorical outcome. Yet the metaphor is not latent in the moment of speaking, but is retroactively placed in the subject's locution by the other. As such, second, there is a dialectical relationship between subject and object at play here. The subject furnishes a metonymic object that surprises the other, and the other, as the locution of signifiers, confers upon the subject's communication a new meaning. Lectures 6 and 7 further explore the nature of this other, According to Lacan, the other must be both a real, living subject and something quasi-anonymous, a symbolic locus and treasure trove of signifiers. As such, the other operates as the mainspring between the registers of the real and the symbolic. This is the sense in which the big other exists. Now, of course, as you may know, Lacan will later go on to say that the big other does not exist, but this is perhaps referring to its symbolic character as a manner of insistence rather than existence. Nonetheless, there remains a dimension of the big other that incarnates itself in the flesh, so to speak. It is necessary for someone to embody this big other for it to function. Lecture 7 adds to this characterization of the other its defects and contradictions, which are necessary components in eliciting the comedic effect of pleasure in the speaking subject. And to be a source of contradiction means that when dealing with the other, we are in fact dealing with another subject, a subject who has its own system of signifiers and metonymic objects that are distinct from the first speaking subject, but not completely different from it either, for there must be some shared symbolic world for a joke to work. It's for this reason Lacan now adds to this schema another layer that reduplicates term by term the initial schema. At the same time as embodied subject, the other is constituted as a censor in its inhibiting function and in conferring a sense or meaning, thereby drawing a phonemic connection between sense and censor. The other functions as a filter that orders and obstructs what can be said and heard. And this is where the joke functions. It strives to make heard in an indirect manner what has been obstructed, the repressed desire as already mentioned. It's in this context of inhibitions, including aggressive tendencies, that the joke has its effect of surprising the other. If a joke is to work, and if by working we mean surprising the other in bypassing the inhibitions and obstructions put up by the other in its function as censor, then a joke must divert the other's attention away from the path down which the joke is heading. This is the role of the joke's facade, or the lead-up to the punchline, which makes you think the line of thought is going one way, only to suddenly go another. In cognitive linguistics, such statements are called garden path sentences, exemplified by the line by Groucho Marx, "One morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I'll never know." Thought about in terms of the schema, the joke's facade leads the other to focus and fixate upon a particular metonymic object, which establishes the imaginary solidification of the other. The punchline then surprises and retroactively transforms the meaning of what led up to it. The reformulation of the schema then allows us to consider the difference between the comic and a witticism. The witticism, or the punchline, functions at the level of the symbolic, and it is sudden and surprises. The comic operates at the level of the dual relation, affecting humor and an elaborate development of something that draws in the attention of the other. The laughter evoked by the comic transpires when there is a discrepancy between imaginary and real. The comic's role is drawing a link between the subject and the metonymic object in such a way as to show this gap between the object and an unsatisfied desire. We can see this exemplified in the joke Lacan provides about the examinee who, in being asked about different historical events, replies with exclamatory comments about the blood, death, and horses, rather than delivering factual information that is in fact being requested by the examiner. The ridiculousness of the situation reveals the humorous contrast between what is expected and what is actually happening, but also is what facilitates the effectiveness of the punchline at the end of the joke. And all this leads to Lacan focusing on love as the high point and mainspring of comedy due to its exemplary expression of this gap. Although he does not bring out this phrase here, and will eventually in this seminar, we might recall the famous line where he says that love is to give what one does not have. That what we love is not the object, but what the object lacks. At the same time, love is marked by a fixation upon an object that we think we want and that we think we want to want us. It is not the love of two characters for each other, but in fact the obstacles that subvert the characters' ability to realize this love that is the engine for a romantic comedy. The film Annie Hall, directed by Woody Allen, is one of the clearest expressions of this. For whereas most romantic comedies end with some happily ever after consummation of love, Annie Hall demonstrates the logic of the saying that the worst thing that could happen to you is getting what you actually want. And it's in this pronounced gap between what you imagine getting if you got what you want versus what you actually get when you get what you want, wherein the humorous effect can be found. Along with liking, sharing, and subscribing, you can financially support this work using the Super Thanks button below this video. To be an ongoing supporter of this channel, I have a Patreon page where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this work on Patreon. Once again, I'm recording from a different location, and hopefully the sound and visual quality of this recording comes out okay. There were numerous interruptions throughout that maybe I'll put some of those reactions of mine in at the end of this. But glad to always share Lacan and theory from wherever I am, and look forward to sharing it again next time. And until then, be well.